Hello all and good afternoon to you wherever you are and welcome. Can we have the next slide, please? And we are going to actually kick off our third and final racial justice presentation. First, we'll have the inaugural welcome by Dean Malik Henfield, the founding dean of the IRJ, and then we're going to go right into our discussion today.
Justice. We are Loyola University Chicago's interdisciplinary hub for racial justice and equity work in Chicago and beyond. We at IRJ consider ourselves a think and do space for converting abstract findings and ideas into long-term action plans. We aim to reimagine our campus as the go-to destination for community-informed scholars and data-informed leaders. We assert that forming teams comprised of skilled scholars and forward-thinking leaders will, over time, produce equitable systems that work for all. We collaborate with our partners to step outside the ivory tower and translate complex concepts in ways that are more accessible to the masses. One of the areas we'll be drilling down on is racial capitalism. Through a series of webinars and in-person conversations, we will explore racial capitalism and ponder its use as a powerful lens to view liberation and freedom from a racial justice and equity standpoint. I, for one, am excited about this series and thankful to our partners in the School of Law for helping to make it happen. We appreciate your interest in our work and ask that you please go to luc.edu/IRJ to learn more about what we're doing and how you can get involved. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending on this gorgeous Chicago day. I am Tavis Jules, and today's topic is racial capitalism and quality of life policing, a conversation on the intersection of race, classism, and policing in a capitalist society. But before we begin, I would like us to take a moment to read and reflect on Loyola's land acknowledgement statement. So I'll just pause here for a minute. And we can move to the next slide, please. And so I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker. But before I do that, just quickly, as I mentioned before, my name is Tavis Jules. I am a professor in the Cultural Educational Policy Studies program and the International Higher Education program here at Loyola, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. We're going to do it Davos style, so if there are questions that the audience have, they can just raise them at any point in time, and I will pause and we'll take those questions live, and then we'll go back to some of the questions that I have to discuss with our speaker today. But before we dive into questions and conversations, I am elated to introduce to you a wonderful speaker, Professor Jamila Morgan, who is literally down the road from us, from our Lakeshore campus at Northwestern University. And she is an award-winning and acclaimed scholar, teacher focusing on issues at the intersection of race, gender, disability, and criminal law and punishment. Her scholarship and teaching examine the development of disability as a legal category in American law, disability and policing, overcriminalization, and the regulation of physical and social disorders, and the constitutional dimensions of the criminalization of statutes. So Professor Morgan received her BA in political science and a Master's of Art in sociology from Stanford University and her JD from Yale Law School. Prior to law school, she served as the Associate Director of the African American Policy Forum, a social justice think tank that works to bridge the gap between scholarly research and public discourse related to affirmative action, structural racism, and gender inequality. I am happy that we're talking with Professor Morgan today because I think that her talk comes at a seminal moment, particularly around issues of the Black Awakening, which we have been witnessing across the US, and some issues and lots of issues around policing, with everything from sort of whether we should fund the police more to we should defund the police more, and particularly about how these things impact people or persons with disabilities. So I think that we're just going to have a great conversation today, touching on so many different issues, and hopefully we just have enough time to talk about these issues. Can I have the next panel slide, please? So today our agenda looks like this with Dr. Morgan. We are going to talk about racial capitalism and quality of life policing. We're going to take questions. As I said, just place your questions in the chat at any point in time, and I will take those questions and ask Professor Morgan about them. We are going to do at the close, we're going to ask you to fill in a brief survey, and that's about it. So let's dive right in. Professor Morgan, so racial capitalism is nothing new. We've been talking about it over the past academic semester. You're our third speaker on this topic. And when we think of racial capitalism, we're often thinking of a system in which the capitalist economy is intertwined with and sustained by racial inequality and exploitation. They're proponents of this concept. They're opponents of this concept. We'll start to get into some of the competing sides of the narrative. But when you think of racial capitalism, particularly with your work around quality of life policing and around your work around disabilities, how do you define racial capitalism? But more importantly, before you define it, can you sort of tell us how you've come to this notion of racial capitalism and how it's represented in your work?
Sure. Well, Professor Jules, it's such an honor to be here. I am absolutely delighted to have these conversations, and I commend Loyola on taking the lead on centering racial capitalism, and as the dean mentioned, uniting scholarship with actual practice in community. That's something that motivates me also as a scholar that is critical of law and sort of steeped in critical race approaches in particular to law. So how did I come to racial capitalism? I came to the academy after practicing law, and the law that I practiced was on behalf of incarcerated people. So individuals who were confined in state prisons and local jails across the country. We were using constitutional litigation to think through how to challenge some of the challenging conditions that incarcerated people face every day in prisons and jails across America. So using the 8th Amendment to try to obtain access to medical and mental health care, to help get our clients out of solitary confinement, to use the law to give people access to programs and supports. And, in doing this work, I recognized sort of the limits of law. In many cases, we would be victorious on our constitutional law claims, and we would be in settlement enforcement. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with law, usually after the case is filed, there are opportunities to settle the lawsuit, and through either private negotiations or negotiations with the supervision of courts, you can work through remedies to some of the legal injuries, the problems generally that your clients are facing. And in this particular case, I was a part of a class action lawsuit against the state of Arizona and their entire prison system, which was depriving people of access to adequate medical and mental health care. I had a client who I corresponded with in writing, who I learned was in one of the facilities in the state of Arizona because she had served lookout for a boyfriend who engaged in a petty theft and allegedly alerted, and eventually was convicted of alerting him of, anyone that might have observed the act taking place. This client in particular had a history of disabilities and was also an incredibly talented student, and in many ways sort of got caught up in a relationship that ended up being abusive, and again, led to this particular criminal conduct. What was also significant is that the state of Arizona was not treating her disabilities, and in many ways failed to acknowledge the severity of her psychiatric disabilities. And unfortunately, that client, on the second year of her 3-year sentence, died by suicide. So this was a very significant point in my development as an attorney. And at the time, I was looking to understand and surface how someone like my client, Miriam Abdullah, could have ended up in a situation where she was, incarcerated and detained and facing, a 3-year prison sentence for serving lookout on this petty theft offense. And in that sort of reflection and discovery, I discovered Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag. That book changed my life. It was a way for me to think about the problem of mass incarceration in a broader lens, in a lens that would not only surface for me the function of our punishment systems here in the States, but also the racialized, gendered, class dimensions of this problem of mass incarceration, which as a lawyer were not surfaced in the tools that we were using. It was pretty much a focus on law, how to apply law to the particular facts, and then on the settlement side, how to negotiate with recalcitrant defendants who claimed there were limited resources, even though it's a rich state, who believed that our clients were malingering or lying about their conditions, and ultimately who failed to provide constitutionally adequate care, even at the expense of our clients' lives. And so for me, Golden Gulag and Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore's articulation of racial capitalism in the kind of broader structural sense allowed me to understand sort of the pathways into criminalization, how through sort of racialized exploitation, and in particular, the sort of profit-seeking motives of our broader punishment systems, of which I'm including police, jails, and prisons, could create conditions where individuals are subjected to extreme forms of violence, and whole economies are sort of, local economies are sort of built upon that violence. And so I don't know if it's apparent for those outside of law, but when we think about law and the problems of mass incarceration in our field, it is very rare to think beyond the individual. And so criminal law is constructed as about the individual wrongdoer. The questions of criminal law sort of pertain to, was there a wrongdoing? Did the individual commit harm? Is there mens rea? Is there an actus rea? Is there the mental element? Is there the conduct element? And very little is discussed as to how sort of conditions of poverty, precarity are in many ways conduits into the system, and same also with sort of the racialized exploitation of these systems, which I'll talk about. And so that's how in broad part I came to racial capitalism, again, through my work as a prison rights litigator. And through Ruth Wilson Gilmore's articulation, I've since sort of delved into the study of racial capitalism and applied it now as a scholar to my work on policing and punishment systems more broadly.
Thank you for that. The question here that I'm sort of thinking about and toying with, particularly as you talk about your work, is that given everything that is happening in America today, we cannot not have a conversation about sort of the death of so many Black people at the hands of police. And particularly, you think of the last person, you think of the Memphis killing, which was just a couple of weeks ago with Tyree Nicholas. And so the question then becomes is that, you know, when we look at policing and we sort of hear the two sides of the argument, we should fund them more, we should defund them, we should invest sort of more into maybe psychological systems, or we should sort of take that money and do other things with it. The question that I'm sort of thinking about and toying with is that in today's society, driven by everything from, you know, artificial intelligence to deglobalization, globalization, to bank failures as we've had recently, etc. You know, from a racial capitalist perspective, what do you then see as the purpose of policing? Or let me rephrase that, you know, what can racial capitalism teach us or tell us about policing? And for the critics of the concept of racial capitalism, who sort of argue that it's not a valid concept anymore, and they often argue that it oversimplifies the relationship between race and capitalism, sort of, how would you respond to that?
Well, it's a brilliant question, Professor Jules. So I'll take it from the lens of looking at, as you've invited me to, sort of policing. So the way that we talk about policing in society, and I think this lends itself to what are the focal points of discussions on police reform, is that police function to respond to harm. More specifically, police are there to enforce our criminal laws, to also maintain order, you know, promote public safety in the common articulation, protect and serve. Those are the operating sort of assumptions that I think narrate the conversation that we have about police reform. Now, when I think about policing informed by racial capitalism, I am now not looking predominantly at, or exclusively, I should say, at the more kind of serious offenses as they've been articulated, right? So the homicide offenses, the manslaughter offenses, which comprise a small proportion of the reasons why people are incarcerated, the 2.2 million people that are incarcerated, and the 7 million on probation and parole. I'm thinking about all the other crimes that might be characterized as violent crimes, but when you delve into them, it is not clear that there is any sort of physical harm component to the particular crime, whether it's a harm to self or harm to others. So then I think of what are now police doing if it's not, well, the other thing to note is even with respect to the serious crimes, our clearance rates in terms of the rates to solve these serious crimes are pretty low. Here in the city of Chicago, data suggests that the clearance rate for homicide is somewhere around 60%. So even if we accept that the police are at all connected to responding to exclusively and predominantly crime, or responding to harm, or acts of maintaining order, restoring order, etc., there's another component of what they do that often doesn't center in these discussions about police reform. So I'll center on a few. So the function of police in society is also to police the normative boundaries of community. And this is where I think we can think about gentrifying communities as heavily policed spaces, or at least monitored spaces. We can think about the function of residential segregation and producing conditions where communities, low-income communities, are not only systematically deprived of access to resources, but where, again, police can focus geographically on identifying individuals that might be suspected of engaging in a whole host of non-harmful conducts. We've talked in movement spaces about the drug crimes under the war on drugs, but I'm also interested in sort of how misdemeanor offenses and sort of low-level criminal offenses, whether it's disorderly conduct, vagrancy, sit-lie offenses, a whole host of offenses that police are also responsible for enforcing, that go more to maintaining the aesthetics of community, policing the boundaries of community across cross-racialized spaces. And importantly, these sites also become places of sort of revenue extraction. So The typical role of police is that they target quote unquote criminals, they arrest them, they take them away to jail. But they can also, as they did in the city of Ferguson, which most notably was centered in the Department of Justice's investigations and finding report, they can target individuals for a whole host of municipal code violations, misdemeanors, traffic law violations, and through citing them, the revenue that come from paying off those fees and the surcharges that can attach for the failure to pay those fees became a huge part and component of how the city of Ferguson, yes, that Ferguson, maintained its municipal budget. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that the way that we think about policing in mainstream discourse is to focus on what don't take up the majority of police's time. That is the enforcement of the serious crimes that we're all scared about. But we neglect in that framing to think about the vast role that police play in, again, constructing the boundaries of community, policing access to shared public spaces, as we see in a number of municipalities that are targeting unsheltered communities under these same kinds of quality of life offenses, which I'll talk about, these low-level misdemeanors, these citable offenses. This becomes a way of producing revenue for the city's coffers, for a number of cities. And that kind of perverse profit-seeking motive is in many ways exploited based on sort of the racialized conditions of many of these communities that we see across America. And so in many ways, when I think about the Ferguson case, the city of Ferguson is, using these predatory policing practices to target predominantly Black motorists, according to the Department of Justice report for traffic violations, to cite them if they fail to pay violations within a timely fashion. And that supports the city's budget, right? A community that had been divested from over generations now becomes a key component of the budget. And the DOJ's recommendation was to stop those practices, right? To eliminate the draconian fines and fees and the penalties on top of those fines and fees that were contributing, to an incentive on the part of the Ferguson Police Department to target motorists for traffic violations, again, these low-level criminal offenses. So the function of police is to also extract, and it's to extract from racialized communities and low-income communities, and to invest in the infrastructure that contributes to and produces forms of violence that we presume police are to respond to in the first instance. And that's, I think, for me, something that perhaps in other fields are acknowledged and recognized, but within our field of law, that's not considered a way of thinking about the police role in society. And so to me, the intervention of racial capitalism is important because it pushes the basis of the critique. So I can't possibly say in response to the picture that I've just painted that police training will solve that problem. Because I'm suggesting there's a profit motive within the police function that it's not going to be trained away, right? These are incentives that are baked into the system. And in many ways, I don't think that it's an overly simplified account, because in thinking through sort of a racial capitalist lens, we can see how other policies and structures and laws can sort of intersect to create the conditions where these extractive policies and forms of predatory policing can particularly take place. And that can go to local government law, at least from my standpoint as an attorney and legal scholar, local government law. It can go to the regulations that govern how municipal courts function, questions of due process in the constitutional sense. The Fourth Amendment is implicated. All of these various legal institutions interact with the social infrastructure to, again, produce conditions where low-income Black communities become sort of the pool of extraction, if you will, that police can rely on to sustain their budgets. I have more examples of other cities. I see this also in cities, major cities that are policing through criminal law, misdemeanor, quality of lifestyle offenses, unsheltered communities, like in Los Angeles and Seattle, for instance.
In light of what you've said, there are two things I'm thinking about, and here I'll also invite, if the audience have any questions, again, just put them into the chat button, and I will ask Professor Morgan's those questions. And so here I'm sort of thinking about 2 or 3 things. So these are going to be long questions. So, you know, as academics, we like long things, but let me try to think. So there are 2 things that you're thinking about. One of them is me jumping ahead. So you can sort of hold me back and say, we can talk about this. But one of the things I saw as I was listening to you talk about your experiences in Arizona, and some of the police, the policing, it got me starting to think a lot about consent decrees. And recently, a new consent decree was given, and I know that Memphis is considering it. Chicago has a consent decree that has a sort of an iffy type issue, and I know that you're new to Chicago, so we don't need to stick on Chicago politics. But the question I'm trying to get at is, when you use the term quality of life policing, can you tell us exactly what do you mean? But because we have gotten, we all have different images of what policing should be, and sort of the way that we've talked about, the way that you've talked about policing and sort of what its role is. And I sort of think about the police are there to protect me, but then as a Black man, I feel like the police does more harm than good to me, because I feel like if I'm pulled over, you know, there's a whole sort of baggage that I need to sort of be prepared with, which I shouldn't have to deal with, but that's just sort of the way it is. And so I'm thinking of my experiences as a Black man and the limited exposure that I've had with law, and hopefully it remains that way. But then I'm also sort of thinking about, I'm having a viral reaction to your notion of quality of life policing, because I'm not sort of envisioning it. So I need you to sort of break down that quality of life policing. And then secondly, if we were to sort of redress or maybe address some of the issues that we think that we have with policing, I'm curious about what then becomes your thoughts on this notion of a consent decree. Can a consent decree lead to a type of reparative justice that we're all hoping for, where we sort of get hopefully what you might be referring to as quality of life policing? Is this one way to get it, or maybe we need to be thinking about quality of life policing from a very different perspective?
Yes, great question. So when I use the term quality of life policing, it is a term of art within law. It actually is traced to the Giuliani administration in the city of New York. So it's reference to a bunch of criminal laws or criminal offenses that are about preserving the quality of a community and preventing sort of physical or social disorder from disrupting the community. So it is a reference to things like laws that prohibit disorderly conduct, excessive noise. It can also refer to, you know, the mainstream public intoxication, public urination, even a whole array, loitering and anti-loitering laws, vagrancy laws would be a kind of quality of life offense, in that the particular laws ensure that certain people don't appear in public spaces or don't congregate in public spaces. DC has a quality of life offense called incommoding, and you can actually be removed from the sidewalk. Cited in a really harsh case, one person was arrested because they were standing in front of their stoop in the middle of the sidewalk. The officer instructed them to leave, and they didn't leave, and then they were arrested for this incommoding kind of quality of life offense. And one of the quotes that I remember from the opinion was the young man, it was a teenager, Black teenager in DC in the mid-90s. And his statement to the officer upon his arrest is, "How can you arrest me in the place where I live at?" And that to me captures so much of the harms of quality of life policing, because who determines the particular aesthetics of the community? It's the dominant culture. It's the largely in gentrifying communities, the new sort of middle to upper class, largely white residents that come into a community. If they call, 911 to report a disorderly person, or an unsheltered person taking up the space, usually the laws that are used to get the person out of the space are quality of life laws, right? So what I'm trying to suggest is, even though there's sort of benignly termed quality of life, and even though many of us have been in cities and counties across the states where we see maybe unsheltered communities occupying public space, and we might in our kind of superficial glance term them as blight or term it as disorder, the enforcement of these laws are harmful to marginalized communities, our unsheltered communities, individuals experiencing mental health crisis. So there's a host of laws that I've looked at in my work on the criminalization of mental illness and disability, where having a crisis in public can be a basis for arrest. There are a number of offenses that, like disorderly conduct is probably the most iconic one, where acting disorderly, including behaviors that are linked to mental crisis, can be a basis for police arresting you. Now, they might not know you're in crisis, or if they do know that you're in crisis, they could arrest you because they might not have a basis for civilly committing you. So I want to suggest that quality of life policing serves a particularly pernicious function in regulating access to public space, and it also can be a stand-in for what should be social services, provided by a behavioral health system, which is to say, the police are out there arresting people for behaviors related to crisis, when if we had a robust sort of behavioral health system where people could access behavioral health on a chronic care basis so that they're not sort of pushed into crisis, we would obviate the need for the enforcement of these laws in the first place. And relatedly, I want to call out the City Council of Chicago that just passed a law that makes it a crime to assault an EMT worker. Now, here's the thing. No one wants EMT workers to be assaulted. That's not my point at all. But there are a number of offenses that can already target that particular conduct. What the City Council did in particular was make it easier to capture people in the web of criminalization, where the state law standards might not apply to the particular conduct. And I want to suggest that that kind of, again, sort of, related to sort of this like quality of life policing offense sort of situation that I'm describing, it's an opportunity to criminalize individuals on the basis of disability, because who tends to assault, and this is through fear of apprehension, not hitting, that's battery under Illinois law, but who tends to engage in these assaulted conducts of EMT workers? It's individuals in mental crisis. And so we should think about, I think, more holistically, how quality of life policing becomes a pathway into policing and managing and tracking right into the criminal legal system communities that are racialized, marginalized, and dealing with conditions of extreme precarity. The last thing I'll say about quality of life policing, if it's not already obvious, they target activities of daily living that happen in public spaces. So quality of life policing also includes sit-lie offenses, sitting and lying on a public bench. It includes public camping. These are local ordinances that target, again, the propping up of tents, which have obviously a disparate impact on unsheltered communities who are in public spaces because they have no place else to go. A variety of other offenses that would relate to sort of engaging in, again, the activities of daily living in public, like sleeping in cars, can also be targeted under this regime. So in thinking about who tends to be most vulnerable to quality of life policing, again, the racial capitalist lens explains why we would see racialized persons, or at least negatively racialized persons, as most impacted. When I looked at the data in terms of the enforcement of these various categories of quality of life offenses, I found racial disparities in who was targeted for these offenses in a number of jurisdictions. So for disorderly conduct and noise violations, for instance, we would see disproportionately Black defendants facing these particular charges or arrests, and the arrestee was identified as a Black person. Same also in Southwest communities, we would see racial disparities along within sort of Latinx and Native communities in particular. Public intoxication tends to be the quality of life offense, where Native Americans have the highest disparity of charges under those statutes. And so I just found that the racial sort of disparity is particularly troubling. And again, thinking about these system vulnerabilities, who tends to be in public spaces, why it is that Native Americans would be disproportionately targeted by public intoxication offenses. The kind of racial capitalist lens helped me understand sort of the structural vulnerabilities and what was producing conditions where the individual now is at the mercy of an officer. So that brings me to consent decrees. I'm trying to bring a larger lens to the study of policing and criminal law within law, and the legal academy and profession in particular. I recognize that litigation is a limited tool for responding to these myriad of social issues, but it's not to suggest that we don't have legal reform options available. A consent decree, particularly one issued by the Department of Justice, doesn't have to only provide what the law says, right? It can go beyond the law's prohibition. That's another way of saying it. It can build on the floor, that is the constitutional standard, right? So in a particular set of consent decrees, including the city of Chicago, there's discussion of sort of racial profiling, right? Unconstitutional searches and seizures, and sort of the role of race, and also I should note disability is mentioned as well in policing decisions, right? Who to stop, who to cite, et cetera. The law matters, of course, but that shouldn't be the end point. And with the consent decree, you have the opportunity to build in reforms that go beyond the law, right? That can include things like discussions of budgets, right? Reallocating maybe crisis response services from the police to behavioral health specialists. So here in the city of Chicago, we're dealing with the CESA implementation. The vision behind the CESA implementation, our crisis response state law that was signed by Governor Pritzker in 2021, as conceived by the youth activists at Access Living that were a big part of pushing for this law, was to decouple the police from mental health crisis response. The act is also named after Stephon Watts, who was killed in a sort of encounter with police while experiencing a mental health crisis. But the implementation of CESA has continued to involve police. And in fact, the recent guidance issued at the end of December suggests that when an individual is labeled as engaged in criminal conduct, the police might be involved. Now you might say, well, yeah, that seems to make sense because the police enforce crimes. But as I told you, there's so many crimes that it's unclear what the harm is outside of occupying public space or contributing to the disorder of a particular public space, which I'm arguing are not the harms that we think police should be entitled to respond to. So the carve-outs in the CESA law still incorporate police into behavioral health crisis response and make it difficult to make the argument that if we remove, at least in the defund model, one version of it, if we remove a particular function of police, we can therefore remove some of the resources that go to serving that function. Crisis care, mental health crisis care in particular, is a compelling case. The police unions arguably, not even arguably, have stated outright that they are not happy with having to respond to individuals in crisis, and more specifically have said that it takes up way too much of their time. Like if you look at the percentage of 911 calls, it's about 7 out of 10 relate to either quality of life or mental health crisis for jurisdictions that were studied in this particular survey. So it's a big component of what police do. Remember, as I've suggested, we need to shift the way that we think about what police are doing. It's a big component of what police do. So a consent decree, in light of the limits of law and the inability, maybe through the political process, of developing new ways of responding to behavioral health crisis, a consent decree could be a way of decoupling police from crisis response and rerouting funds that might have gone to labor or staffing generally to support the crisis response into behavioral health systems that are not carceral and not punitive, because we simply don't want to just transfer the policing function from one area to another and pretend that behavioral health systems can also be carceral, can't also be punitive as well. Same with reparative justice. It's possible that a progressive, let's say at least, Department of Justice could develop a set of TRC processes, narrative reparations. I hesitate to say sort of monetary reparations, but maybe a kind of fund, maybe akin to like the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. There's nothing in the law that prevents that from being incorporated into a consent decree. But what we see is, again, departments of justice that are largely liberal, that are really focusing in on responding to the kind of individualized acts of harm that they see police as engaged in. And indeed, police are engaged in individualized acts of harm. But what I'm suggesting is that the problem is structural and a kind of inability, I think, to think on a broader basis, by and large, about some of the conditions that are contributing to these sort of predatory forms of policing, harmful forms of policing in general. I think the one exception being the Ferguson report, where there is a discussion of the forms of predatory and extractive policing that that department was engaged in, and a set of proposals to redress that, right, to stop the extractive policing, in addition to a host of other issues. So again, I'm suggesting that consent decrees are sort of one tool in the toolbox to respond to these problems, but at least insofar as we can see, the consent decrees over the last 20 years responding to these harms, they've been ineffective in redressing the full scope of the problem. They've also, I think the last report from the city of Chicago's as to the enforcement of the city of Chicago's consent decree said that their compliance with the terms of the consent decree was somewhere between like 5 and 10%. Like, that's not acceptable. Like 10% compliance with a consent decree is woefully non-compliant. So, even if I am right that we can get these more expansive, holistic, reparative components in a consent decree, then the next step is the enforcement of the consent decree and the political will to push it forward.
No, that's really interesting to think that there are issues with enforcement, and sort of, I think that goes back to issues around trust. I think there's a whole set of challenges around trust, and if we should trust the police, how we should trust them, sort of when we should trust them, and why we should trust them. Tangentially going off of that, I wanted to go out to a question that we have from one of the audience members, and the question goes: Can you speak about $1 million blocks and how they extract wealth from Black communities?
So I'm not familiar with $1 million blocks, unfortunately. So I am not able to answer that particular question. But maybe the person could put more detail.
Sure, it's listed as anonymous. I'll just ask the person to sort of give a little bit more detail. But the second part of the question is interesting in sort of this, the extraction of wealth from Black communities, and I think it goes back to issues of racial capitalism, and partly some of the criticism levied at racial capitalism is this notion, as I started off by saying early on, is this idea that racial capitalism is basically a sort of an oversimplification of the relationship between race and capitalism, and that it does not adequately account for the diversity of experiences and outcomes within racial groups. And so when we think about sort of the extraction of wealth from Black communities, and we also sort of think about it from a policing perspective, the question then becomes is there really a root connection between policing and racial capitalism? That's the sort of it, and I challenge you to sort of think about it, and not just say, well, because there are issues with race involved, that's why it's linked to that, because I think we can easily sort of slip into that sort of mold by just saying that, well, it involves race, and we can also go the opposite way and say, well, it's so complicated that we need to sort of think about it from a different perspective. And so I guess what I'm asking you is to sort of break down racial capitalism into the way that I would tell my students, like you're explaining it an alien, and then link it back to policing, and why these two concepts are so inextricably intertwined in such a way that we need to understand them to be able to help us to understand what it is that we're trying to ask our police force to do, and ultimately how it is that we're trying to get towards that quality of life policing that you're talking about, that sort of makes us feel comfortable as citizens, yet at the same time not making it feel as though the police is sort of doing more than they should be doing or less than they should be doing when it comes to certain racial groups.
Yeah, so I'll try to tackle that. So the first thing I would say is that, like, when you had said earlier, you know, there's this idea that like we have the police protect us, but then as a Black man, not necessarily so, right? So one of the things that I think is important to sort of name is that, like, the police don't serve everybody. We can see this along lines of vulnerability, right? The police, when they're clearing out unsheltered communities from public spaces, they're not protecting and serving the people that they're clearing out, like in most obvious formulation. They are acting in many ways as sort of foot soldiers of the property owner interest in that particular area, and ensuring that public spaces, I guess in the most charitable formulation, remain open and accessible to all. But the all is not really all, because open and accessible doesn't include people who are unsheltered. When I think about the city of Los Angeles, the majority of unsheltered communities in unsheltered communities include a substantial proportion, I'll say it another way, of people who are racialized as non-white, and also people with disabilities. The city of Los Angeles is also experiencing the greatest housing shortage in its history. Affordable housing through a variety of state law policies has been difficult to build and dole out. As the city of Chicago's sort of access living case demonstrates, accessible housing for people with disabilities is also a low priority on the part of the city. And so the people in public spaces, right, the people who are then policed are people who have been sort of left out of this rapid development, quote unquote, that has swept up the city of Los Angeles for the last several decades. The drive to sort of build out these new condominiums in the beach communities, and sort of communities that are adjacent to the beaches have not been matched in, again, where we can see the divestments happening, like communities in the inner cities, communities next to our large, or Los Angeles is large transportation depots, right, that are also experiencing sort of the toxic effects of environmental degradation. So my account, at least, is that we're seeing, in my view, capitalism is always inherently racialized, right? The vulnerabilities that are produced are directly connected to sort of the profit-seeking motives and the extraction that's happening. And like in kind of my sort of work, when we show that structural background, it's a part of an effort to show that police function to uphold these broader sort of capitalist ends, right? The function, again, of police, we can't just think of police as protecting and promoting public safety. They're doing something else. And I think if I can make the claim in my work, and many of us scholars in criminal law think about it like this, if we can make the claim that police are doing something else, then legal responses and solutions should also respond to that particular something else. And so dealing with unsheltered communities is one aspect. As I've said, the kind of ideal role of police, to me, I don't think that, and this is sort of back to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, it's, the history of police, whether it's their role in breaking up labor strikes, the Pinkertons, right, whether it's the well-known history of, sort of to walk backward, the well-known history of the role of police in policing access to public space, the quote unquote ugly laws that Susan Zweig writes about. Before that, whether it's the role of police in the slave patrols, we see throughout history that police are protecting certain communities at the expense of others. And I think that framing the central questions of like what police do to further, again, this extractive quality within our capitalist society has to be centered if we're going to make the claim that police are serving too many functions, that they're not appropriate responders to a number of social problems, including homelessness, including mental health crisis. That's sort of my goal in engaging with racial capitalism, right? To suggest that it's race, but it's connected with other systems of oppression, right? And race becomes sort of this sort of malleable tool to loop together and dispose of classes of people that cannot fit in and cannot promote the capitalist order. And so and again, that is not an account of policing, at least that we have in law. And I don't think that account of policing outside of abolitionist spaces has really infiltrated our mainstream discourse. And I also would say this is not an account to demonize every police officer. I'm talking about policing as an institution and its function. And I think that what that means is that these conversations about how to remove, let's say, police from this particular crisis response dealing with mental health challenges, or a crisis response dealing with unsheltered communities, that can be a conversation that in the sort of stages from the police are playing too much of a role in our social provision and should be divested from the kind of implementation of these particular social or crisis responses, that police can kind of be a part of that drawdown, right, from the kind of current reform to the abolitionist future, if that's the account or the vision that one has, to make it sort of kind of clear that defund and divest does lead to abolitionist futures, and that we can't stop at reform if we want to tackle some of the kind of pernicious functions of police that are reflected in history that continue to this day.
No, I think that's interesting, and you sort of send me thinking down a tangent, because as you saw, the guest put a link in there to the $1 Million Blocks, and which basically talks about the ways in which Illinois spending on incarceration is ineffective and costly, and sort of linked to this notion of how we spend on incarceration and how ineffective it is, because there's some really interesting numbers here around the $1 Million Blocks that are being shown. And it got me thinking that, the city of Chicago just approved a $63 million increase in the police budget. So it roughly takes the police budget in Chicago to approximately 1.69 billion. So let's round it off evenly at $2 billion. We have a $2 billion budget for the police force of Chicago for a city with 3 million people, right? If we sort of do the math, which I'm really bad at, that's soon is going to be sort of $1 one person there per year. But yet we also still have all these other crimes in Chicago. And so it would be good if you can sort of help us to sort of contextualize that the crime, the way that we think of crime in Chicago, and sort of the way that we think in policing in Chicago, is not about the budget, because no matter how much money we throw at it, it probably will still be there. And I think this goes back to this notion of what the anonymous attendee was asking in their question about the ways in which, because we've extracted wealth from Black communities, that in order for us to sort of think about improving crime in Chicago, I would argue, is that we need to give that wealth back to Black communities so that they can therefore take care of the community in the ways in which they know how. And just sending police into those communities is not going to solve the problems of crime. It's going to be, we have to sort of thinking about alternative ways and alternative strategies to be able to help us to sort of think through that. And so the question then becomes, is that sort of given what you said before, what juncture in history would you say that we moved from policing being about protecting a citizen to one where it's more about extracting wealth, in the sense, or whether we think of it in terms of like funding, or fundraising? So where did that sort of, where was that period where we moved from to protect and serve, right, towards sort of extractive wealth? And I add that because I'm trying to sort of think of the link between sort of racial capitalism and policing when we talk about this notion of extracting wealth in a way that doesn't allow for generations to be able to have access to that wealth, but at the same time sort of thinking through about how did we get to where we are today? How did we get from protecting and serving to sort of a disproportionate response to everything? And I'm not endorsing crime here per se, but I'm just sort of saying it just seems like the response that we have to everything is just sort of disproportionate. So is that like a societal change that we've had? Have we as a society just sort of metamorphed and we just sort of need more tactics and sort of greater force? Or is it that something else? What that something else is, I don't know, but I'm just sort of curious. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah. It's there's so much I could say, because it's really surfacing a lot of threads of US history, but also kind of a history of policing. So I'll respond to kind of the history question. So your question is like, when did we move from protecting citizens to the kind of extractive, or what I've termed like predatory policing, just to draw from literally the Department of Justice's own articulation of what, let's say, the city of Ferguson was doing, but other cities have been guilty of as well. So what I'm suggesting is that the police never protect everybody, right? That's the first move that I'll make, but that the incentives to use, let's say, fines, fees, so like the levying of municipal offenses, citations, etc., we see that practice increases as more crimes are on the books and as more crimes are being enforced. And that, I think what we can say is it traces back to sort of the rise of law and order. And so I study disorder, just specifically. If it's not obvious, I'm very fascinated by the way that we police disorder as a society. Now, disorder has always existed, whether we classify disorder as people in place that are people in public spaces rather that are labeled as disorderly, or disorderly conditions, right? Like, sanitation, waste, noise, what have you. But the response to disorder using criminal law is relatively recent. So in, like the post-World War II era, as we see sort of the rise of the kind of urban locale and city, and the importance, I think, of the movements for Black civil rights and liberation and other social movements, the movement for LGBT equality, women's liberation. These movements were framed as disorderly, right? I think of the kind of the Kerner Commission report and its centering of protest, and the anti-war protests can fall in this category as well, as sites of disorder and threats to the social fabric of urban communities. Facilitates this, at least from the state standpoint, obsession with maintaining and controlling disorder. There are a number of criminal laws that have existed on the books, like vagrancy, that then show up again to police protesters, in some cases civil rights protesters. See this also with disorderly conduct. It's existed at common law, for centuries, but the policing and enforcement of it show up again in this like post-World War II era, well into the 60s and 70s, to police movements, to police individuals that were resisting the dominant cultural norms of a community, right, on their identity, on the basis of their statuses, what have you. And so I think it's in that era that there's this sort of hyper focus on using criminal law as a way of responding to at least social problems that pertain to physical and social disorder within a community, right? The access to public space, the maintaining of a certain aesthetic in a community, the policing boundaries of communities. I've also in my research been looking at, okay, when did police start responding to crisis response? And that has a longer history, but it's again, in terms of the sanctioning of the practice, it has a long history. It can go back to, I think the earliest law I found was 1829. New York state law says police can respond to individuals in crisis if the individual is behaving violently, right? So we see kind of a sanctioning through law. But in the 70s, when we have the period of deinstitutionalization, when individuals with disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, also termed mental illness or developmental disabilities, are moved from the congregate large state asylum, right? The Pembroke Asylum, the Willowbrook Asylum, into the idea was from these large congregate facilities into community and home-based living. We see that because there were not sufficient investments made in community and at-home services to access chronic and crisis care services, that many of those individuals ended up filtering into the criminal legal system. Because again, their sort of transition from the large congregate state institutions into the community is coinciding with, again, this policing of disorder in public spaces, right? The kind of policing of public spaces that becomes an issue in many urban locales coincides with the deinstitutionalization movement. And so the convergence there is that you have a basis through these quality of life laws to now criminalize people that are having crisis in public spaces, and literally the term trans-institutionalization, like Bernard Harcourt has centered this in his work, or some of his work, kind of refers to from deinstitutionalization, we get from the large state-run institution into the other institution, i.e. the jail or the prison. There's a number of critiques of trans-institutionalization, but I just want to sort of put it out as one theory to explain kind of this history and this shift from at least the protection of some to the protection of even fewer, right? So I don't see it as from protection to kind of extraction. So as to the extraction point, again, I can't place in history when we start to see police departments realizing that the use of criminal law enforcement and the targeting of certain groups can produce, very profitable conditions so that they can sustain whole wings of their department off of that. Again, in the more modern example of Ferguson, that there was a vast amount of wealth to be extracted just through the levying of fines, fees, and citations, right? I've been in Chicago for 6 months and I've already had to pay about $400 in fines and fees for parking, right? So imagining someone that's in a precarious position, how much wealth there is to be generated by these particular programs. I can't name in history when that practice arises, but I'm sure that the answer is out there somewhere. But I do at least think about the conditions that are making it so that we don't even question these policies, right? And as legal scholars, there's certainly not a basis, unless they violate the Eighth Amendment's sort of prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishments and excessive fines and fees. Like, there's not really a legal basis for challenging these extractive policies unless it's through, negotiated settlement or popular campaigns that pressure the police department to, legalize certain conduct so that they then don't, cite on the basis of it, or again, popular campaigns that seek to remove the police from certain functions, like the campaigns to remove police from traffic code enforcement. So if you have non-police traffic code enforcement and we remove the power to cite and arrest, of course, with these new civilian traffic code enforcers, that might be a way of responding to the problem. So there's proposals to do that. And in particular, we're seeing that there are a number of jurisdictions that are, as I said, trying to decouple police from crisis response. So that kind of brings me to the question of the budgets. We do have documented evidence to suggest that sort of throwing money at an issue, hiring more police, will not necessarily respond to the problem of violence. And I particularly want to note that there have been a number of studies, particularly out of Boston, and David Kennedy's work comes to mind, but here also in Chicago, to suggest that violence interrupters, so civilians that are integrated in the social communities that are experiencing the violence, are more effective at curbing the violence than a police officer or whatever system of policing, whether it's hotspot policing that is the new sort of fad for responding to acts of harm. And again, the clearance rate, I think, should suggest that we have a problem with effectiveness. The problem is that the politics of sort of criminal justice reform suggests that no candidate is going to win by going in there and saying, we should hire less police, we should defund the police. Like we saw the backlash to the defund movement, even in jurisdictions where the request was to defund for the purposes of redistributing to other social support. Like the people's budget out of Los Angeles County, for instance, found that when surveyed, people were in favor of redistributing funds, more funds, to behavioral health supports. And right after the racial reckoning uprisings of 2020, supported removing some funds from police into the sort of coffers of behavioral health systems, like the Department of Mental Health at LA County. So, I fear that the window has closed for meaningful conversations about budgets because of the backlash against defund. But I do want to suggest that there's two ways of thinking about defund. Defund as a path to abolition, and defund as a way of right-setting budgets that for so long reflect the ineffective policy of throwing money at social problems or throwing money at acts of harm, and using police as a way of responding to what are deeper structural crises of, our neoliberal era. And so that's what I would say to that.
No, thank you. That's good. And I think this links nicely to a question that we have from the audience, which says, what are ways people who don't work in criminal law can resist quality of life policing?
Yes, no, I think that's a really good question. So one, I would really support, or encourage, individuals to kind of look at the local organizing that's happening in their communities to decriminalize a host of these particular offenses. So I'm going to just lift up one group, but there's a number here in Chicago, but like the Illinois Union for the Homeless, they have been just on the front lines as directly impacted by many of these quality of policing laws, like resisted through sort of collective action, sweeps of their communities, and have also been pushing to, decriminalize through advocacy and survivor stories, a number of these offenses. Or at least one thing I should also note is, when I say decriminalize it, it could be that the jurisdiction decides not to make it a criminal offense, but they could still make it a civil citable offense. And that still poses problems for wealth extraction, right? Because we're still citing people we can still extract. Municipal ordinances aren't necessarily classified as criminal offenses, but they're still extractive. And so decriminalizing quality of life offenses means that we can't arrest people and put them in jail, but it might not eliminate the problem. So really what we should be pushing for is either non-enforcement or legalization. So legalization would be to change the law books. I really think it's practical to seek non-enforcement. If you're in a jurisdiction where there's an affordable housing shortage, then we should be focusing in on getting people access, first temporary, then permanent housing. And at the very least, and at least one court in the Ninth Circuit has found this, you can't punish people if they have nowhere else to go. And so non-enforcement would be one way of responding to these quality of policing problems. Two, really pushing our legislators at the local, state level in particular to start funding diversion programs, right? To start funding non-police interventions of behavioral health systems. So I encourage everyone to start monitoring the implementation of the CESA Act and to ensure that if they're interested in these issues, that they're connecting up with the local groups like Access Living and Equip for Equality and others, CCV, I think, as well, that are engaged on these issues. Here at the Center for Racial and Disability Justice, we're monitoring and tracking CESA implementation as well. So, there's ways to kind of plug in to support sort of non-policing interventions for people experiencing crisis, because we know that, that's a pathway into police violence, just again, to lift like Stephon Watts and others who were tragically killed in these while attempting to access services. I think the last thing that I'll note is, and I haven't really mentioned this, but state civil commitment laws. State civil commitment laws here in the state of Illinois say that if a person is refusing access to care and treatment, the police are the only one that can transport them into services. And that's a huge problem because, again, involving police, arguably even ones that have been exposed to a few hours of training, can also lead to the encounter turning violent. And so if we think about quality of life policing and who it's tended to protect, I think as concerned residents here in our locality, we should resist efforts to respond to, again, people in public space or people experiencing crisis in their homes or in public space punitively, that we should support efforts that invest in a robust behavioral healthcare system, and that there are laws right now being implemented or debated, including the civil commitment one that I was suggesting. There might be organizing that can happen to make it so that other individuals, concerned relatives, alongside the person with a disability, the psychiatric disability, can be also a part of ensuring that they have access to treatment that are not sort of punitive pathways into accessing treatment. So there's opportunities, like I said, to plug in, to stay tuned. I guess one last group, Chicago Appleseed, has been tracking that bill, that ordinance that I mentioned that the city council passed, making it a new crime to assault, put in fear of apprehension EMTs, and they're identifying that particular law as a kind of criminalization on the basis of disability. And there's ways to advocate with them as well, and you can find that on their website.
There's another question in the chat here. It says, my question comes back to your discussion of investment in Black communities. There are discussions in environmental justice about incarceration and reentry to their neighborhoods. I wonder what investment could/should be prioritized in these communities' neighborhoods to make the transition safe and or supportive for these people back into their communities.
Yeah. So, I'm not necessarily like a sort of reentry specialist, but there are people that are thinking very creatively and also engaged in activism to support individuals that are reentering back into society. So I wanted to mention, and I've lifted Access Living in particular, and their reentry coordinator, Chris Huff, has been thinking about these sort of questions. I think their initiative is called like Accessible Public Safety. And that's sort of a community-based model for how to support individuals as they re-enter back into society, if I'm understanding sort of the question.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, our time is coming slowly to an end, and so there are two sort of wrap-up questions I have, unless there's one last question from the audience. And the first one is, what are you reading? What should we be reading to get a better sense of a deeper understanding of sort of racial capitalism and its correlation to quality of life policing? And then the sort of final question I'd like for you to think about as we wrap up is sort of where do we go from here? You've given us a historical overview. You've put in the current context about some of the challenges that we're facing. You've helped us to sort of think about the role, scope, and function of quality of life policing, and it's linked to sort of racial capitalism. We've talked a little bit about the consent decree and whether or not that can lead to reparative futures, etc. And so after you tell us what you're reading and what we should be reading, I invite you to sort of tell us, where do you think we should be going from here?
Okay, so I guess at any point in time, I'm reading quite a lot, but I think I'm most relevant here. I think it's a great historical account. It's called The Power to Die, Slavery and Suicide in British North America by Terry L. Snyder. And Dr. Snyder is looking at how our suicide prevention laws in large part grow out of responses to attempted suicide by enslaved people. It's very sort of intense reading, but I think it kind of documents in a lot of ways like the brutality of our response to individuals in crisis and the racialized sort of context in which these particularly punitive policies and responses, including, I'm reading it to identify if I can find some scholar that tells me when police get involved in mental health crisis response. And so that's why I have that particular book on my agenda. And it's also, again, helping me think about like that sort of mutually constitutive relationship between capitalism and the racialized system of chattel slavery. The other books that I would recommend, where I think that there's an analysis that resounds in racial capitalism, but they're also bringing in other structural critiques, would be A Decarcerating Disability, which is Liat Ben-Moshe's latest book. I think it's a great sort of accounting of like the political economy of deinstitutionalization and how that context sort of fueled an industry, behavioral health industry that has contributed to the sort of impoverishment of people with disabilities. And of course, we think intersectionally about people with disabilities, so including people of color, but the extractive nature of sort of behavioral health systems after the period of deinstitutionalization, why it's been so difficult to get affordable in-home and community-based care. These are sort of low-wage jobs that have not been invested in or subsidized by local governments, and that has huge implications for the rights of people with disabilities to live at in their homes. That's the other book that I would sort of put on the radar.
Okay, thank you. And sort of where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? I think that sort of plugging in, as I said, I'm sort of coming outside the discipline, and I've gained a lot by engaging with sort of this racial capitalism lens. So admittedly, out of my sort of zone of expertise in many ways, but I think that it's important for those of us that care about these issues to think interdisciplinarily about them. And to try to, plug into ongoing conversation. So I'd encourage you to sort of plug in with what's happening in terms of these laws, and as concerned residents to kind of plug in and hold our elected officials accountable when these conversations are had, and to maybe on an individualized basis. One takeaway is to think about how we in our individual lives rely on police, and to what extent our reliance on police might be contributing to these forms of marginalization that we see in public space. So for me, I have a policy of definitely not calling the police, just as a general matter, to report signs of disorder, right? The noisy neighbor, the car that's stalled out, that someone won't move, what have you. Like, these are sort of quality of life issues that can be better directed to a 311 or other city services, right? So to kind of think about our own reliance.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I want to thank our audience members for joining us and for the thoughtful questions that they've had. Alison, can I get that slide, please? We ask that you take a minute to fill in our survey, and we ask that you stay connected with the IRJ. You can sort of use your camera phone to click on the little black and white, I'm blanking on the word here,
QR
little black and
code.
white image there to take the survey of today's talk, and we encourage you to join, follow us at the IRJ, whether it's through Twitter or our LinkedIn page. We want to thank you very much for joining us today. We want to thank Dr. Morgan for her sort of exposition of racial capitalism and quality of life policing. It certainly has been an enjoyable discussion that I have had today with you. And thanks again for coming across to Loyola and having this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Jules. I appreciate it.